Hey church family, it is so good to be with you here tonight. If you want to grab your Bibles and open up to Ezra chapter 8. Ezra chapter 8 is where we're going to be tonight. I've got a couple announcements for you just as you're flipping over and we're getting going. I told you a couple weeks ago to be thinking of where you would like to go next in terms of our Bible study here on Wednesday night. I got a few suggestions and I landed on one. As long as we are still virtual on Wednesday nights, which I think at least will be for the short term, if not longer, book studies seem to work best for a couple reasons. Mainly because you know exactly where we're going to be. Since we're not able to be together to discuss and converse like we would in a normal class setting, the only way I can think to kind of compensate for some of that discussion is for you to study ahead of time and kind of be ready to engage with the material. And the only way that you can really easily do that is when we're doing a book of the Bible. You know where we're going to be. If you were with us last week, you knew that we covered Ezra 7. So you pretty well could take it to the bank that this week we're going to be in Ezra 8, which we are. So with that in mind, my plan, now you know what we've learned about plans over the last year, so this is subject to change, but my plan right now is to do Ecclesiastes on Wednesday night. I've never taught that. That's one of the few books that I've never, in my full-time professional ministry career, I've never taught Ecclesiastes. So I'd like to teach it all the way through. I think there's some really, really good kind of practical nuggets for us. Of course, most agree that Solomon wrote this, an incredibly wise man that offers a lot about how to live life as a God follower. Solomon, and you've probably heard me give this summation before, but it's one of my favorite backstories of why to write a book. Solomon did what many of us try to do at some point in our life, and we think, I can do it better than God. I am more capable. I'm smarter. And maybe we never articulate it that way, but we fall away from God and we trust ourselves more than we trust Him. And so we think, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. I can do family on my own. I can do career on my own. I can do church on my own. I can do all of this on my own. I don't need God. And almost all the time, if we're willing to admit it. 100% of the time, if we are willing to be truthful. Some people are stubborn enough, and I can at least empathize. Probably not a good thing to associate with myself, but I can at least empathize with the stubbornness of not wanting to admit when we're wrong. But almost anyone that is willing to be honest will tell you that it's impossible. You cannot do life and be fulfilled and have the things God has planned for us on our own. Solomon tried, and Solomon had every resource under the sun, one of the wealthiest men to ever exist. He had a supernatural gift of wisdom, and he tried every which way. That's the irony of Solomon, is that he had all the wisdom in the world and still felt it necessary to try everything else to fulfill himself in life, in marriage, in business, in money, and all of it. And then he gets to the end of his life and he says, I couldn't do it. I tried, and that's basically what Ecclesiastes is this letter that he more or less writes to the world to say, I've tried everything, I've thrown everything and the kitchen sink at it, and I can't figure out a way to do it without God. And friends, if Solomon couldn't figure it out, then we can pretty well take to the bank that it's not meant to be figured out, because that's not the plan. That's not the way God wants us to be. So there's a lot of practical meat. Ezra made sense for right now because, of course, we're doing Nehemiah, which we're getting close to the end of, so we're going to be starting a new sermon series here soon. I'll leave you in suspense for what that might be. But Ezra made sense for us to study hand in hand, and I hope that you have benefited from Ezra. It's probably a book you've not studied as often. If you have, my guess is that there's at least a percentage that have never studied Nehemiah or Ezra. There's probably another smaller percentage that has studied Nehemiah, and then probably the smallest group is ones that have studied both Ezra and Nehemiah prior. So I hope that this has given you a new perspective on Scripture. It's helped kind of explain Nehemiah in our sermon series, and we're going to continue today looking in Ezra chapter 8. Last update I want to give you, I've had a lot of you call and text me. Of course, I had a shoulder injury a couple weeks ago. I had an MRI this week on Monday and met with a surgeon. kind of good and bad news. There's my rotator cuff and bicep all look good. My labrum is tore, and that's a little different than what we were initially thinking, but the surgeon said it really doesn't change a whole lot in terms of the actual surgery. So the next kind of step is making sure that all this gets approved through insurance and everything. So there's still some hurdles that we have to go through, some red tape and things like this that I'm sure you can empathize with. But ideally, it will be fixed surgically, and it'll be done here within the month. That's the hope. But, of course, there's a lot that could happen between now and then that could prevent that. So just please keep that in your prayers if you would. And we are now, without any further ado, going to actually dive into Ezra chapter 8 tonight. So as we dive into Ezra chapter 8, you notice probably another list of names, and you're probably thinking, well, geez, this is getting a little much. Nehemiah has some of that in his book. Ezra, we've already seen a couple times in his book. So I want you to wipe the sweat off, because we're not going to dive into that again. We have actually looked at this a couple times through Ezra and Nehemiah, the significance of the listing of families. I'll just kind of leave you at this. The verses 1 through 14 is this list in Ezra chapter 8. And again, this is another one of those waves coming from Persia over into Jerusalem, and these are prominent members of different families and things like this. So we won't dive really into it, because again, if we look in Ezra chapter 8, we see Ezra chapter 8, of course, right now in verses 1 through 14, and then Ezra chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, we see some of these kind of lists. So I'll just reference you back to some of our prior lessons on Ezra and Nehemiah to look at the significance of all of these different names and kind of what that foreshadows moving forward. So now I do want you to notice one thing in particular that's kind of unique here, and we're going to kind of talk about why this is. I want you to look in Ezra chapter 8 and verse 15. Ezra 8 and verse 15. This is right after kind of the big list of families and things like this. So if you look in verse 15, it says, I assembled the exiles at Savannah Canal, and we camped there for 3 days while I went over the list of the people and the priests who had arrived. I felt that not one Levite had volunteered to come along. Now, I want you to remember, and this is probably something, again, I think I've talked to you about this before, it would be a worthwhile exercise for us to kind of do a timeline of Ezra and Nehemiah, because we are switching back and forth. So I know I felt this way, so I can only imagine that you would have felt this way too, of sometimes feeling a little bit confused of like, but I thought we already talked about Levites being there. I thought we already talked. Remember, Ezra came first, and this is a number that I probably haven't given you out loud yet, but Nehemiah came, and we're not 100% sure about this, but probably between 10 to 15 years after Ezra. So all of this is happening first. So anything that we read about in Nehemiah is coming later. And again, it's all coming in waves. And so if you're thinking to yourself, well, haven't we already talked about Levites? We've talked about Levites with Nehemiah. And again, we've even referenced it some with Ezra, but this is a new kind of wave of people where Levites had not volunteered to come. And I want us to dive in really kind of why that might be. It has potential to be significant, but mainly I just wanted you to notice that kind of being an anomaly as we read through this, and just to get a little bit of clarity on the difference in the timeline between Ezra and Nehemiah as we're coming to the end, really, of both of these books. So now I want to offer you one kind of interesting, if you're really into kind of Bible history and stuff like that, you might get a kick out of this. If you look in Psalm 137, now this is upper level Hebrew history here that I'm not an expert in, but I did have a pretty cool commentary that kind of touched on this. I was looking up reasons why the Levites would not have wanted to come, and one brought up an interesting, now this is just a theory, I'm not saying, and this is not really a deal breaker, this is not a salvation issue, so, you know, we can totally just let our minds run wild, it doesn't totally matter. But look in Psalm 137. 137. I've been in the Psalms more lately anyway. If you remember, I was at Graymere Church of Christ a couple weeks ago for a preaching workshop that focused on the Psalms, and so I've kind of been focusing some on them myself. And in Psalm 137, it's a rather short psalm. It's only 9 verses long, but it starts out, it says, "Beside the river of Babylon, we wept and we thought of Jerusalem. We put away our harps, hanging them on the branches of poplar trees, for our captors demanded a song from us. Our tormentors insisted on a joyful hymn. sing us one of the songs of Jerusalem. But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while we are in pagan land? Now, there's some kind of subtext within the original manuscripts that we've found, and again, this is where it kind of goes above my expertise, but one commentator was pointing out that it seems very likely that, because if you remember, the Levites were a group of people, they were larger than the priests, and their job was to help facilitate worship. Now, back then, they use instruments to do that. Many references throughout Scripture in the Old Testament to harp players and things like this. So we're kind of surmising here. We know, of course, Babylon captured Jerusalem. That's been a major theme through Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, here the psalmist is recording that they had been taken captive, and that their captors, the Babylonians, had demanded that more than likely the Levites would play them a song, a song from Jerusalem. So it would have been one of the songs that would have been played, potentially sung in worship back in Jerusalem. They refused to do it. They said, no, we can't do this. This is outside of the temple. And so there is some... It's not in scriptural history, but there is some secular history that points to that psalm and the Levites and says that this is pretty ruthless, but that the Babylonians actually cut off the fingertips, the ends of their fingers, because they wouldn't play. And because of that, they're still Levites, but they didn't have fingers really, and they couldn't play the harp anymore. So there's a theory that there actually was Levites with Ezra. How does this all matter? The theory points us to that the Levites that then went to captivity and ultimately would have been with Ezra, did not have the fingers to play. So while they were technically Levites in terms of their history, they were not able to serve in a Levitical role. And so Scripture records for us that there were no Levites, meaning that there was no Levites able to fulfill the role of Levite. That's one theory. That's a really kind of the scenic route to get around to one theory. The other theory, which may in reality be more likely, is that the Levites were just comfortable in Babylon. They just did not want to leave, which seems weird because, again, Levites were with the priests. I mean, their whole role, their whole job, they were descendants of Aaron. Their whole role was to be in temple worship and things like this. But they would not have been the first men or women to fall in the trap of comfort and just being too comfortable to work and be of service to God. It's interesting. I keep wanting to try to make parallels for you to our world today. It's interesting because Ezra had authority. He had written authority from King Artaxerxes. He had money. But what he didn't have is men. He didn't have the Levites that were there to worship. And I think it's an interesting kind of parallel, perhaps a little bit more figurative of a thought for us. But I want you to consider our world today. We have resources. We have a building. We have money that's able to do the work of the church. But the requirement is still people. We are so many thousands of years removed from Ezra. I talked about this kind of same idea with Nehemiah on Sunday. We're so many thousands of years removed, yet there's still a lot of similarity to the prayer that they were praying to God of, we are so sorry that we have fallen away and came back and all this kind of stuff. And in a lot of ways, Ezra is no different. He had money, he had resources, he had opportunity, but he still struggled to find people. And that's no different for us today. And so I want us to challenge ourselves to not be a part of that problem. I think all of us on paper would love to be a part of a church that we were struggling to find things to do because we had so many volunteers, all the jobs were covered. We had the resources that every project that we came about was funded. We had the time to devote to all this. That would be the perfect scenario. I've never seen a church that's been there, but that would be the perfect scenario. But right now, we have an opportunity. COVID is around, but that presents more opportunity in a lot of ways. We have resources, like every church last year, we took a hit money-wise, but we still have funds to do things. But we need people. We need people that are willing to step up and say, I'm here to serve. It may be in a different role than I've ever served before. It might look different than it did prior to COVID. I'm just going to tell you right now so that you're not disappointed, it probably will be. It will probably be a different role than you've ever served. I've had to serve in different functions than I've ever had to do before. Doing what we're doing now, recording a Wednesday night class, almost unheard of prior to last year, but has become standard now. We have to adapt and be willing to change a little bit in terms of our expectations, but still have the same heart that Ezra and Nehemiah did to say, God, I don't see your big plan. I don't know exactly what you want me to do. You want me to go back to Jerusalem? You want me to ask the king of Persia to fund this? You want me to build a wall in 2 months? I don't see how this is possible, but if you want it, then I'll do it. That goes back to one of our very first lessons in Nehemiah was, do I value the things God values? One of the things God values above all else is service, is giving yourself, your time, your resources, but really, it's you. You know, it's one thing, and it's something we're called to do, to give on Sunday morning. Absolutely. That's part of worship. Giving, time, that's one thing. But are you giving yourself to say, God, I'm willing to serve in whatever capacity you would have me to serve? That's something that we see Ezra struggling with. He had all the other boxes checked, but he still needed people. I pray that we won't be the same problem or have the same problem that Ezra did all those years ago, and that we would have, more than enough people to serve in all the ways that we have opportunities right now. So as we continue through the book of Ezra, chapter 8, we'll see in verses 16 through 20, Ezra kind of addresses the lack of Levites. And again, that would have been significant to them because even people that were kind of on the margins of Jewish culture understood and knew that the Levites and the priests were essential to worship back then. Now, that may be hard for us to wrap our minds around because, and this is where I hope we never, ever, ever take Christianity and the new standard that we have now for granted that we find in the New Testament, because it is just a different world now than they had back then. There was no personal worship in the sense that you and I could, sit down and sing or pray, or let's go even more literal, to read our Bible. Again, not only did they obviously not have the New Testament, that didn't exist yet, but even the Old Testament, they might have had pieces, but it was not put together entirely. They couldn't have said, oh, I wonder what, the judges said, I wonder what, so-and-so said back in Psalm chapter 2. I mean, that just didn't even register as a possibility. They had what they had, and they had people that were trained in memorization of certain books and things like this, but worship was very different. So it was obviously a noted omission to not have the Levites. So Ezra addresses this in 16 through 20. We won't read all that for the sake of time, but I do want to kind of talk about a few of the things that he mentions at this point. So, Ezra does a really interesting thing here. And we read in 16 through 20 where he is kind of talking about the lack of Levites. And he comes up with a plan of how to appeal to Levites to come to Jerusalem. You notice that he doesn't accept failure initially. He says, I see we're obviously lacking Levites. No way around that. But he ends up putting together essentially a caravan of people to go back to try to appeal to some Levites to come. And he uses a very particular group of people. He sends back a few of the prominent men, as well as what Scripture says, men of understanding, which would have probably been people that had some scriptural training. They're not Levites, obviously, but they could have been connected to the Levites in some way. They could have been training to be a priest. They could have been a lot of different things, but it just says men of understanding, which kind of implies to us that they would have had some connection to the Levites. And what's really interesting there is Ezra points out a topic that even we still discuss today. This was a plan that I had for 2020 that obviously got scrapped because of COVID, but I had a whole sermon series ready to go on spiritual gifts. And we were going to do a series on finding what spiritual gifts you might have and things like this. I don't want you to worry. The series obviously is written. It's not scrapped. It will come probably not in 21, just because the needs of the congregation have shifted a little bit. But in years to come, Lord willing, we will do that series and to find where we are each most capable. Why do I bring that up? Because Ezra understood that, he could have sent, any group of people back to get the Levites, but he understood that in leadership that there was some value to having particular people do particular jobs. And he said, you guys, and he made this group up. He said, you guys are the most likely to connect to the Levites, and thus that's the highest percentage chance to bring them back. He chose these people very particularly. And I hope that we take note of that, because even in the New Testament, we see Jesus, kind of picking certain people for certain roles because he understands that we have strengths and we have weaknesses. That kind of goes back to what we just talked about with Ezra needing people, and are we willing to step up in that way now? Are we willing to be the people the church needs right now? Kind of a subcategory of that is, are we willing to step up in ways that we have strengths? If there's something that you have particular skills in, are you willing to step up and say, whether this is your preferred or not? Because I completely understand. If you do something in, let's say IT as an example. That's obviously a skill set you have that it kind of parallels to church. We have technology needs now more than ever. You might say, well, Keaton, I do that as my job all day, Monday through Friday. I don't really want to do it at church. I understand. I understand that. But are you willing to kind of push past some of that and say, I have these skills, I have these hobbies, I have these interests. Let me see if I can find a way to use that to best serve the church. And I've done, in fact, if you think back to 2-3 years ago now, we did a gospel meeting at Oak Grove, and I spoke on the parable of the talents. And one of those points, if memory serves me, was this idea of, are we best suited for a particular job? When we're trying to figure out what our talents are and things like this. Anybody can go do certain jobs, but there are certain things that need particular skill sets, and you might be best served in that role. That seems to me what Ezra is doing here, is he's kind of found this group that obviously has a particular skill set, but also a particular cultural background and all this kind of stuff. And he says, I'm going to utilize that specialty to give us the best chance of bringing some Levites back to begin our worship to God. Then if we look in verses 21 to 23, we see that Ezra prays a prayer of protection. He begins to talk about and also suggest a fast, which is a really interesting idea. I did a video on fasting, I don't know, probably mid last year. And it's one of these things that, we don't talk about a great deal, but can be an opportunity for us to focus on a particular topic. And that seems to be what Ezra's doing here. He wants the people there to really hone in on praying for protection for people as they travel to Jerusalem. And so he suggests a fast in order to accomplish that. And what's really interesting here, one of the things that's really interesting through this prayer, we notice that he says, "For I am ashamed to request of the king an escort." And what's interesting here, and you might wonder what that is, well, most theologians agree that this is Ezra being extra mindful of his reverence and worship to God. Because remember, he had already basically said to God and to the king of Persia that he said, God, I trust that you will always lead us to where we need to go. You will keep us safe. which he has up until this point. And so I think what this means is Ezra didn't want to seem like he's contradicting that by saying, well, God, I trust you, but just to be doubly sure, I'm going to ask the king for an escort. And, a lot of times that's something that I think we can empathize with and maybe something we need to correct, because we have faith in God, we trust God on paper, but then we also hedge our own bets and we try to do things our own way and say, well, I trust that God is going to, help me do X, Y, and Z, but I'm going to do all these things to kind of help just, lend the odds to my favor. And I think there's a danger in that, when, again, there's nothing wrong in doing things to help best provide the outcome that we want. But when we go to God and say, God, we're putting this in your hands, we trust you, we trust that your will be done, then we need to believe that that is going to be done. And that doesn't mean that we're just totally naive to the real world and that we have to, bury our heads while God's working or anything. But there is an element of, are we trying to kind of do for God what we think needs to be done? We're trying to do things on our own. And that was something that Ezra was extra mindful of. And in fact, I found a commentator that put it in a really beautiful way. He says, we see that this good man, talking about Ezra, had more anxiety for the glory of God than he did his own personal safety. Like, the danger was very real. Like, they, again, traveling from Persia to Jerusalem, to Babylon to Jerusalem, these were very treacherous roads. And as you see from Nehemiah, there were a lot of people that did not want servants of God to succeed. So there was a very real danger that they were in, but he had more anxiety about fussing God and doing the wrong thing in God's eyes than his own personal safety. Man, is that something you can say today? And I'm going to be honest, like, I can't think of many times where I could say 100% that I've had more anxiety about God's feelings towards my actions than my own personal well-being or so. I mean that's that is faith to a whole nother level. But do you see the outcome? We look at that and think, well, that's naive. Why would you have faith like that? But you can't knock it. He not only was safe in every trip that he went on, he got the king of Persia to finance the rebuilding of the temple. The king continually sent men. He continually sent supplies. God provided protection at every single turn. Like, as naive as it might seem from our perspective, he has every result possible. I mean, we can't knock it, and we shouldn't knock it. And I hope that we would take a page out of that playbook and say, we probably could be better. I could be better. You probably could be better in that amount of trust that we put in God in his dealings with our everyday life. So then we see in Ezra 24 through 30, we see kind of the distribution of valuables. This is another amazing thing, another kind of check mark in Ezra's box, is that the king of Persia continually sent valuables. And again, we don't use the same unit of measures, but if we do some kind of very basic calculations and conversions and look at the modern day value of some of the silver and gold and stuff, the king was sending millions of dollars of valuables. And this was not in raw materials. This was just in valuables to present to God as an offering. This was in addition to all the timber, all the protection, the king would have spent probably, close to in the hundreds of millions of dollars if you value all the timber that he sent, all the men that he sent, all the valuables. It's enormous. And this was for a nation that he wasn't even part of. This was for a God that he didn't outright serve. This was a pagan nation by every, metric. But he continually sent. So Ezra is kind of breaking all this up, and he divides the valuables among the leaders of the priests, and he gives them each a portion that they are in charge of moving forward. So as we kind of wrap up Ezra chapter 8, you'll notice in verses 31 and 32, it kind of summarizes the departure back to Jerusalem. Again, they've kind of gathered some of the offerings from the king and looking for the Levites and things like this. You'll see a very familiar phrase. It says, God's hand was indeed upon us. That's That's a phrase you're probably familiar with now through both Ezra and Nehemiah, just that continual pointing to God, that He is the one that has protected them through everything they've went through. And then in verses 33 and 34, they arrive back in Jerusalem, and they do a really interesting thing where they weigh all of, and are very precise about weighing and accounting for and recording all of the precious treasures that the king had sent back to offer to God. And that was, of course, what its purpose was, is to offer it to God. And I think it's just this constant reminder, again, just looking for parallels to our world today of being stewards of what God has given us. You know, God blessed them with that through Persia, and he expects, you know, it to be taken care of properly. It's not something that we're supposed to be flippant with, or something that we're supposed to, you know, do haphazardly, but to take the blessings that we have, which in a very real way is what they had, and use them in a way that is most fitting and most able to glorify God and spread His kingdom. And then at the very end of chapter 8, we see them continue to offer things to God. They began to offer burnt offerings. They began to do a sin offering. And then in verses 36, they relay some of the orders from King Artaxerxes. They knew they were coming back to Jerusalem, so not only did the king give some things to offer to God, but also gave some orders for his governors in the region and things like this. And then as it closed out, they continued to worship God. I hope this continues to kind of just build in your mind this profile of Ezra and Nehemiah and their ultimate commitment to God through thick and through thin, and I hope we're able to emulate them here today. Guys, I'm really excited to continue our Ezra study. Kyla and I, if you were here with us Sunday, you know this. Kyla and I won't be here this Sunday. I'll be doing a gospel meeting kind of retreat for the Southside Church of Christ in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Kyla is able to come with me, with it being on a Saturday, and so we're pretty excited about that. So we won't be here, but I'm very excited for you to continue to get to be here and worship at Central. I will miss you greatly, and I know you're in for a treat, getting to hear somebody else and some different perspectives and some material and stuff like that. And then, Lord willing, we will be back the following week, and of course I'll see you Wednesday night, and then see you that following Sunday morning to continue our Rebuild series, looking through the life and the eyes of Nehemiah. I can't wait to see you there.